Chapter 17 of Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 17. Trouble at Hamley Hall. If Molly thought that peace dwelt perpetually at Hamley Hall, she was sorely mistaken. Something was out of tune in the whole establishment, and for a very unusual thing, the common irritation seemed to have produced a common bond. All the servants were old in their places, and were told by some one of the family, or gathered from the unheeded conversation carried on before them, everything that affected master or mistress or either of the young gentlemen. Any one of them could have told Molly that the grievance which lay at the root of everything was the amount of the bills run up by Osborne at Cambridge, and which, now that all chance of his obtaining a fellowship was over, came pouring down upon the squire. But Molly, confident of being told by Mrs. Hamley herself anything which she wished to hear, encouraged no confidences from any one else. She was struck with the change in Madam's look as soon as she caught sight of her in the darkened room, lying on the sofa in her dressing-gown, all dressed in white, which almost rivalled the white wanness of her face. The squire ushered Molly in with, "Here she is, at last," and Molly had scarcely imagined that he had so much variety in the tones of his voice. The beginning of the sentence was spoken in a loud, congratulatory manner, while the last words were scarcely audible. He had seen the death-like pallor on his wife's face, not a new sight, and one which had been presented to him gradually enough, but which was now always giving him a fresh shock. It was a lovely, tranquil winter's day. Every branch and every twig on the trees and shrubs were glittering with drops of the sun-melted hoar-frost. A robin was perched on a holly-bush, piping cheerily, but the blinds were down, and out of Mrs. Hamley's windows nothing of all this was to be seen. There was even a large screen placed between her and the wood-fire to keep off that cheerful blaze. Mrs. Hamley stretched out one hand to Molly, and held hers firm. With the other she shaded her eyes. "She is not so well this morning," said the squire, shaking his head. "But never fear, my dear one. Here's the doctor's daughter, nearly as good as the doctor himself. Have you had your medicine, your beef tea?" he continued, going about on heavy tiptoe and peeping into every cup and glass. Then he returned to the sofa, looked at her for a minute or two, and softly kissed her, and told Molly he would leave her in charge. As if Mrs. Hamley was afraid of Molly's remarks or questions, she began in her turn a hasty system of interrogatories. "Now, dear child, tell me all. It's no breach of confidence, for I shan't mention it again, and I shan't be here long. How does it all go on, the new mother, the good resolutions? Let me help you if I can. I think with a girl I could have been of use. A mother does not know boys. But tell me anything you like, and will, don't be afraid of details." Even with Molly's small experience of illness, she saw how much of restless fever there was in this speech, and instinct, or some such gift, prompted her to tell a long story of many things: the wedding day, her visit to Miss Browning's, the new furniture, Lady Harriet, etc., all in an easy flow of talk which was very soothing to Mrs. Hamley, inasmuch as it gave her something to think about beyond her own immediate sorrows. But Molly did not speak of her own grievances, nor of the new domestic relationship. Mrs. Hamley noticed this. "And you and Mrs. Gibson get on happily together?" "Not always," said Molly. "You know we didn't know much of each other before we were put to live together. I didn't like what the squire told me last night. He was very angry." That sore had not yet healed over, but Molly resolutely kept silence, beating her brains to think of some other subject of conversation. "Ah, I see, Molly," said Mrs. Hamley. "You won't tell me your sorrows, and yet perhaps I could have done you some good." "I don't like," said Molly in a low voice. "I think papa wouldn't like it. And besides, you have helped me so much, you and Mr. Roger Hamley. I often think of the things he said. They come in so usefully, and are such a strength to me." "Ah, Roger! Yes, he is to be trusted. Oh, Molly, I've a great deal to say to you myself. Only not now. I must have my medicine and try to go to sleep. Good girl. You are stronger than I am, and can do without sympathy." Molly was taken to another room. The maid who conducted her to it told her that Mrs. Hamley had not wished her to have her nights disturbed, as they might probably have been if she had been in her former sleeping-room. In the afternoon Mrs. Hamley sent for her, and with the want of reticence common to invalids, especially to those suffering from long and depressing maladies, she told Molly of the family distress and disappointment. She made Molly sit down near her on a little stool, and holding her hand and looking into her eyes to catch her spoken sympathy from their expression quicker than she could from her words, she said, "Osborne has so disappointed us. I cannot understand it yet. And the squire was so terribly angry. I cannot think how all the money was spent, advances through money-lenders, besides bills. The squire does not show me how angry he is now, because he's afraid of another attack, but I know how angry he is. You see, he has been spending ever so much money in reclaiming that land at Upton Common, and is very hard-pressed himself. But it would have doubled the value of the estate, and so we never thought anything of economics which would benefit Osborne in the long run. And now the squire says we must mortgage some of the land, and you can't think how it cuts him to the heart. He sold a great deal of timber to send the two boys to college. Osborne! Oh, what a dear, innocent boy he was! He was the heir, you know, and he was so clever. Every one said he was sure of honours and a fellowship, and I don't know what all. And he did get a scholarship, and then all went wrong. I don't know how. That is the worst. Perhaps the squire wrote too angrily, and that stopped up confidence. But he might have told me. He would have done, I think, Molly, if he had been here, face to face with me. But the squire, in his anger, told him not to show his face at home until he had paid off the debts he incurred out of his allowance. Out of 250 a year, to pay off more than 900 one way or another, and not to come home till then. Perhaps Roger will have debts too. He had but 200, but then he was not the eldest son. The squire has given orders that the men are to be turned off the draining works, and I lie awake thinking of their poor families this wintry weather. But what shall we do? I've never been strong, and perhaps I've been extravagant in my habits, and there were family traditions as to expenditure and the reclaiming of this land. Oh, Molly, Osborne was such a sweet little baby, and such a loving boy, so clever too. You know I read you some of his poetry. Now could a person who wrote like that do anything very wrong? And yet I'm afraid he has. Don't you know at all how the money is gone? asked Molly. No, not at all. That's the sting. There are tailors' bills, and bills for book-binding, and wine, and pictures. Those come to 400 or 500. And though this expenditure is extraordinary, inexplicable to such simple folk as we are, yet it may be only the luxury of the present day. But the money for which he will give no account, of which, indeed, we only heard through the squire's London agents, who found out that certain disreputable attorneys were making inquiries as to the entail of the estate. Oh, Molly, worse than all, I don't know how to bring myself to tell you, as to the age and health of the squire, his dear father. She began to sob almost hysterically, yet she would go on talking in spite of Molly's efforts to stop her. Who held him in his arms, and blessed him, even before I had kissed him, and thought always so much of him as his heir and first-born darling. How he has loved him! How I have loved him! I sometimes have thought of late that we've almost done that good Roger injustice. No, I'm sure you've not. Only look at the way he loves you. Why, you are his first thought. He may not speak about it, but any one may see it. And dear, dear Mrs. Hamley, said Molly, determined to say out all that was in her mind now that she had once got the word, don't you think that it would be so much better not to misjudge Mr. Osborne, Hamley? We don't know what he has done with the money. He is so good, is he not, that he may have wanted it to relieve some poor person, some tradesman, for instance, pressed by creditors, some— You forget, dear, said Mrs. Hamley, smiling a little at the girl's impetuous romance, but sighing the next instant, that all the other bills come from tradesmen, who complain piteously of being kept out of their money. Molly was nonplussed for the moment, but then she said, I dare say they imposed upon him. I'm sure I've heard stories of young men being made regular victims of by the shopkeepers in great towns. You're a great darling, child, said Mrs. Hamley, comforted by Molly's strong partisanship, unreasonable and ignorant though it was. And besides, continued Molly, someone must always be acting wrongly in Osborne's, Mr. Osborne Hamley's, I mean,
and I can't help saying Osborne sometimes, but indeed I always think of him as Mr. Osborne. Never mind, Molly, what you call him, only go on talking. It seems to do me good to hear the hopeful side taken. The squire has been so hurt and displeased, strange-looking men coming into the neighbourhood too, questioning the tenants, and grumbling about the last fall of timber, as if they were calculating on the squire's death. That's just what I was going to speak about. Doesn't it show that they are bad men? And would bad men scruple to impose upon him, and to tell lies in his name, and to ruin him? Don't you see, you only make him out weak instead of wicked. Yes, perhaps I do, but I don't think he is weak. You know yourself, dear Mrs. Hamley, how really clever he is. Besides, I would rather he was weak than wicked. Weak people may find themselves all at once strong in heaven, when they see things quite clearly, but I don't think the wicked will turn themselves into virtuous people all at once. I think I've been very weak, Molly, said Mrs. Hamley, stroking Molly's curls affectionately. I've made such an idol of my beautiful Osborne, and he turns out to have feet of clay, not strong enough to stand firm on the ground. And that's the best view of his conduct too. What with his anger against his son and his anxiety about his wife, the difficulty of raising the money immediately required, and his irritation at the scarce concealed inquiries made by strangers as to the value of his property, the poor squire was in a sad state. He was angry and impatient with every one who came near him, and then was depressed at his own violent temper and unjust words. The old servants, who perhaps cheated him in many small things, were beautifully patient under his upbraidings. They could understand bursts of passion, and knew the cause of his variable moods as well as he did himself. The butler, who was accustomed to argue with his master about every fresh direction as to his work, now nudged Molly at dinner-time to make her eat of some dish which she had just been declining, and explained his conduct afterwards as follows. "You see, miss, me and cook had planned a dinner as would tempt master to eat, but when you say no thank you, and I hand you anything, master never so much as looks at it. But if you take a thing and eats with a relish, why first he waits, and then he looks, and by he smells, and then he finds out as he's hungry, and falls to eating as natural as a kitten takes to mewing. That's the reason, miss, as I gave you a nudge and a wink, which no one knows better nor me was not manners." Osborne's name was never mentioned during these cheerless meals. The squire asked Molly questions about Hollingford people, but did not seem much to attend to her answers. He used also to ask her every day how she thought that his wife was, but if Molly told the truth, that every day seemed to make her weaker and weaker, he was almost savage with the girl. He could not bear it, and he would not. Nay, once he was on the point of dismissing Mr. Gibson because he insisted on a consultation with Dr. Nicholls, the great physician of the county.
"It's nonsense thinking her so ill as that. You know it's only the delicacy she's had for years, and if you can't do her any good in such a simple case, no pain, only weakness and nervousness, it is a simple case, eh? Don't look in that puzzled way, man. You'd better give up altogether, and I'll take her to Bath or Brighton or somewhere for change, for in my opinion it's only moping and nervousness."
But the squire's bluff, florid face was pinched with anxiety, and worn with the effort of being deaf to the footsteps of fate as he said these words which belied his fears. Mr. Gibson replied very quietly, "I shall go on coming to see her, and I know you'll not forbid my visits. But I shall bring Dr. Nicholls with me the next time I come. I may be mistaken in my treatment, and I wish to God he may say I am mistaken in my apprehensions."
"Don't tell me, then. I cannot bear them," cried the squire. "Of course we all must die, and she must too. The cleverest doctor in England shan't go about coolly meting out the life of such as her. I dare say I shall die first. I hope I shall. But I'll knock down any one who speaks to me of death sitting within me. And besides, I think all doctors are ignorant quacks, pretending to knowledge that they haven't got. Ay, you may smile at me, I don't care. Unless you can tell me I shall die first, neither you nor your Dr. Nicholls shall come prophesying and croaking about this house."
Mr. Gibson went away, heavy at heart from the thought of Mrs. Hamley's approaching death, but thinking little enough of the squire's speeches. He had almost forgotten them, in fact, when about 9 o'clock that evening a groom rode in from Hamley Hall in hot haste, with a note from the squire.
"Dear Gibson, for God's sake forgive me if I was rude to-day. She is much worse. Come and spend the night here. Write for Nicholls and all the physicians you want. Write before you start off. They may give her ease. There were Whitworth doctors much talked of in my youth for curing people given up by the regular doctors. Can't you get one of them? I put myself in your hands. Sometimes I think it is the turning point, and she'll rally after this bout. I trust all to you. Yours ever, R. Hamley. P.S. Molly is a treasure. God help me.
Of course Mr. Gibson went, for the first time since his marriage cutting short Mrs. Gibson's querulous lamentations over her life as involved in that of a doctor called out at all hours of day and night. He brought Mrs. Hamley through this attack, and for a day or two the squire's alarm and gratitude made him docile in Mr. Gibson's hands. Then he returned to the idea of its being a crisis through which his wife had passed, and that she was now on the way to recovery. But the day after the consultation with Dr. Nicholls, Mr. Gibson said to Molly, "Molly, I've written to Osborne and Roger. Do you know Osborne's address?"
"No, papa. He's in disgrace. I don't know if the squire knows, and she has been too ill to write."
"Never mind. I'll enclose it to Roger. Whatever those lads may be to others, there's as strong brotherly love as ever I saw between the two. Roger will know. And Molly, they are sure to come home as soon as they hear my report of their mother's state. I wish you'd tell the squire what I've done. It's not a pleasant piece of work, and I'll tell madam myself in my own way. I'd have told him if he'd been at home, but you say he was obliged to go to Ashcombe on business."
"Quite obliged. He was so sorry to miss you. But, papa, he will be so angry. You don't know how mad he is against Osborne."
Molly dreaded the squire's anger when she gave him her father's message. She had seen quite enough of the domestic relations of the Hamley family to understand that, underneath his old-fashioned courtesy and the pleasant hospitality he showed to her as a guest, there was a strong will, a vehement passionate temper, along with that degree of obstinacy in prejudices, or opinions, as he would have called them, so common to those who have, neither in youth nor in manhood, mixed largely with their kind. She had listened day after day to Mrs. Hamley's plaintive murmurs as to the deep disgrace in which Osborne was being held by his father, the prohibition of his coming home, and she hardly knew how to begin to tell him that the letter summoning Osborne had already been sent off. Their dinners were tete-a-tete. The squire tried to make them pleasant to Molly, feeling deeply grateful to her for the soothing comfort she was to his wife. He made merry speeches which sank away into silence, and at which they each forgot to smile. He ordered up rare wines which she did not care for, but tasted out of complaisance. He noticed that one day she had eaten some brown Beret pears as if she liked them, and as his trees had not produced many this year, he gave directions that this particular kind should be sought for through the neighbourhood. Molly felt that in many ways he was full of good-will towards her, but it did not diminish her dread of touching on the one sore point in the family. However, it had to be done, and that without delay. The great log was placed on the after-dinner fire, the hearth swept up, the ponderous candles snuffed, and then the door was shut, and Molly and the squire were left to their dessert. She sat at the side of the table in her old place. That at the head was vacant, yet, as no orders had been given to the contrary, the plate and glasses and napkin were always arranged as regularly and methodically as if Mrs. Hamley would come in as usual. Indeed, sometimes when the door by which she used to enter was opened by any chance, Molly caught herself looking round as if she expected to see the tall, languid figure in the elegant draperies of rich silk and soft lace, which Mrs. Hamley was wont to wear of an evening. This evening it struck her as a new thought of pain that into that room she would come no more. She had fixed to give her father's message at this very point of time, but something in her throat choked her, and she hardly knew how to govern her voice. The squire got up and went to the broad fireplace, to strike into the middle of the great log and split it up into blazing, sparkling pieces. His back was towards her. Molly began, "When papa was here to-day, he bade me tell you he had written to Mr. Roger Hamley, to say that he thought he had better come home, and he enclosed a letter to Mr. Osborne Hamley to say the same thing." The squire put down the poker, but he still kept his back to Molly. "He sent for Osborne and Roger?" he asked at length. Molly answered, "Yes." Then there was a dead silence which Molly thought would never end. The squire had placed his two hands on the high chimney-piece, and stood leaning over the fire. "Roger would have been down from Cambridge on the 18th," said he, "and he has sent for Osborne too. Did he know," he continued, turning round to Molly, with something of the fierceness she had anticipated in look and voice. In another moment he had dropped his voice. "It's right.
Quite right. I understand. It has come at length. Come, come. Osborne has brought it on, though," with a fresh access of anger in his tones. "She might have—" Some word Molly could not hear. She thought it sounded like lingered. "But for that, I can't forgive him. I cannot." And then he suddenly left the room. While Molly sat there still, very sad in her sympathy with all, he put his head in again. "Go to her, my dear. I cannot, not just yet. But I will soon. Just this bit, and after that I won't lose a moment. You're a good girl. God bless you." It is not to be supposed that Molly had remained all this time at the Hall without interruption. Once or twice her father had brought her a summons home. Molly thought that she could perceive that he had brought it unwillingly. In fact, it was Mrs. Gibson that had sent for her, almost as it were to preserve a right of way through her actions. "You shall come back to-morrow or the next day," her father had said. "But mamma seems to think people will put a bad construction on your being so much away from home so soon after our marriage."
"Oh, papa, I'm afraid Mrs. Hamley will miss me. I do so like being with her."
"I don't think it is likely she will miss you as much as she would have done a month or two ago. She sleeps so much now that she is scarcely conscious of the lapse of time. I'll see that you come back here again in a day or two." So out of the silence and the soft melancholy of the Hall, Molly returned to the all-pervading element of chatter and gossip at Hollingford. Mrs. Gibson received her kindly enough. Once she had a smart new winter bonnet ready to give her as a present, but she did not care to hear any particulars about the friends whom Molly had just left, and her few remarks on the state of affairs at the Hall jarred terribly on the sensitive Molly.
"What a time she lingers! Your papa never expected she would last half so long after that attack. It must be very wearing work to them all. I declare you look quite another creature since you were there. One can only wish it mayn't last, for their sakes." "You don't know how the squire values every minute," said Molly. "Why, you say she sleeps a great deal, and doesn't talk much when she's awake, and there's not the slightest hope for her. And yet, at such times, people are kept on the tenterhooks with watching and waiting. I know it by my dear Kirkpatrick. There really were days when I thought it would never end. But we won't talk any more of such dismal things. You've had quite enough of them, I'm sure, and it always makes me melancholy to hear of illness and death. And yet your papa seems sometimes as if he could talk of nothing else. I'm going to take you out to-night, though, and that will give you something of a change. And I've been getting Miss Rose to trim up one of my old gowns for you. It's too tight for me. There's some talk of dancing. It's at Mrs. Edwards'." "Oh, mamma, I can't go," cried Molly. "I've been so much with her, and she may be suffering so, or even dying, and I to be dancing." "Nonsense! You're no relation, so you need not feel it so much. I wouldn't urge you if she was likely to know about it and be hurt. But as it is, it's all fixed that you are to go, and don't let us have any nonsense about it. We might sit twirling our thumbs and repeating hymns all our lives long, if we were to do nothing else when people were dying." "I cannot go," repeated Molly. And acting upon impulse, and almost to her own surprise, she appealed to her father, who came into the room at this very time. He contracted his dark eyebrows, and looked annoyed as both wife and daughter poured their different sides of the argument into his ears. He sat down in a desperation of patience. When his turn came to pronounce a decision, he said, "I suppose I can have some lunch. I went away at 6 this morning, and there's nothing in the dining-room. I have to go off again directly." Molly started to the door. Mrs. Gibson made haste to ring the bell. "Where are you going, Molly?" said she, sharply. "Only to see about papa's lunch." "There are servants to do it, and I don't like your going to the kitchen." "Come, Molly, sit down and be quiet," said her father. "One comes home wanting peace and quietness, and food too. If I am to be appealed to which I beg I may not be another time, I settle that Molly stops at home this evening. I shall come back late and be tired. I see that I have something ready to eat, Goosey, and then I'll dress myself up in my best and go and fetch you home, my dear. I wish all these wedding festivities were over well. Ready, is it? Then I'll go into the dining-room and gorge myself. A doctor ought to be able to eat like a camel, or like Major Dugald Dalgetty." It was well for Molly that callers came in just at this time, for Mrs. Gibson was extremely annoyed.
They told her some little local piece of news, however, which filled up her mind, and Molly found that, if she only expressed wonder enough at the engagement they had both heard of from the departed callers, the previous discussion as to her accompanying her stepmother or not might be entirely passed over. Not entirely, though, for the next morning she had to listen to a very brilliantly touched-up account of the dance and the gaiety which she had missed, and also to be told that Mrs. Gibson had changed her mind about giving her the gown, and thought now that she should reserve it for Cynthia, if only it was long enough. But Cynthia was so tall, quite overgrown, in fact. The chances seemed equally balanced as to whether Molly might not have the gown after all. End of chapter 17. And daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 18. Mr. Osborne's Secret. Osborne and Roger came to the Hall. Molly found Roger established there when she returned after this absence at home. She gathered that Osborne was coming, but very little was said about him in any way. The squire scarcely ever left his wife's room. He sat by her, watching her, and now and then moaning to himself. She was so much under the influence of opiates that she did not often rouse up, but when she did, she almost invariably asked for Molly. On these rare occasions she would ask after Osborne, where he was, if he had been told, and if he was coming. In her weakened and confused state of intellect she seemed to have retained two strong impressions, one of the sympathy with which Molly had received her confidence about Osborne, the other of the anger which her husband entertained against him. Before the squire she never mentioned Osborne's name, nor did she seem at her ease in speaking about him to Roger, while when she was alone with Molly she hardly spoke of any one else. She must have had some sort of wandering idea that Roger blamed his brother, while she remembered Molly's eager defence, which she had thought hopelessly improbable at the time. At any rate, she made Molly her confidante about her first-born. She sent her to ask Roger how soon he would come, for she seemed to know perfectly well that he was coming.
"Tell me all Roger says. He will tell you."
But it was several days before Molly could ask Roger any questions, and meanwhile Mrs. Hamley's state had materially altered. At length Molly came upon Roger sitting in the library, his head buried in his hands. He did not hear her footstep till she was close beside him. Then he lifted up his face, red and stained with tears, his hair all ruffled up and in disorder.
"I've been wanting to see you alone," she began. "Your mother does so want some news of your brother Osborne. She told me last week to ask you about him, but I did not like to speak of him before your father."
"She has hardly ever named him to me."
"I don't know why, for to me she used to talk of him perpetually. I have seen so little of her this week, and I think she forgets a great deal now. Still, if you don't mind, I should like to be able to tell her something if she asks me again."
He put his head again between his hands, and did not answer her for some time.
"What does she want to know?" said he at last. "Does she know that Osborne is coming soon, any day?"
"Yes, but she wants to know where he is."
"I can't tell you. I don't exactly know. I believe he's abroad, but I'm not sure."
"But you sent papa's letter to him?"
"I've sent it to a friend of his who will know better than I do where he's to be found. You must know that he isn't free from creditors, Molly. You can't have been one of the family, like a child of the house almost, without knowing that much. For that and for other reasons I don't exactly know where he is."
"I will tell her so. You are sure he will come?"
"Quite sure. But, Molly, I think my mother may live some time yet, don't you? Dr. Nicholls said so yesterday when he was here with your father. He said she had rallied more than he had ever expected. You're not afraid of any change that makes you so anxious for Osborne's coming?"
"No, it's only for her that I asked. She did seem so to crave for news of him. I think she dreamed of him, and then when she wakened it was a relief to her to talk to me about him. She always seemed to associate me with him, We used to speak so much of him when we were together."
"I don't know what we should any of us have done without you. You've been like a daughter to my mother."
"I do so love her," said Molly softly.
"Yes, I see. Have you ever noticed that she sometimes calls you Fanny? It was the name of a little sister of ours who died. I think she often takes you for her. It was partly that, and partly that at such a time as this one can't stand on formalities, that made me call you Molly. I hope you don't mind it."
"No, I like it. But will you tell me something more about your brother? She really hungers for news of him."
"She'd better ask me herself. Yet no. I am so involved by promises of secrecy, Molly, that I couldn't satisfy her, if she once began to question me. I believe he's in Belgium, and that he went there about a fortnight ago, partly to avoid his creditors. You know my father has refused to pay his debts."
"Yes, at least I knew something like it."
I don't believe my father could raise all the money at once without having recourse to steps which he would exceedingly recoil from. Yet for the time it places Osborne in a very awkward position.
I think what vexes your father a good deal is some mystery as to how the money was spent.
"If my mother ever says anything about that part of the affair," said Roger hastily, "assure her from me that there's nothing of vice or wrong-doing about it. I can't say more. I'm tied. But set her mind at ease on that point."
"I am not sure if she remembers all her painful anxiety about this," said Molly. "She used to speak a great deal to me about him before you came, when your father seemed so angry. And now, whenever she sees me, she wants to talk on the old subject, but she doesn't remember so clearly. If she were to see him, I don't believe she would recollect why she was uneasy about him when he was absent."
"He must be here soon. I expect him every day," said Roger uneasily.
"Do you think your father will be very angry with him?" said Molly, with as much timidity as if the squire's displeasure might be directed against her.
"I don't know," said Roger. "My mother's illness may alter him, but he didn't easily forgive us formerly. I remember once, but that is nothing to the purpose. I can't help fancying that he has put himself under some strong restraint for my mother's sake, and that he won't express much. But it doesn't follow that he will forget it. My father is a man of few affections, but what he has are very strong. He feels anything that touches him on these points deeply and permanently. That unlucky valuing of the property! It has given my father the idea of post-obits."
"What are they?"
asked Molly. "Raising money to be paid on my father's death, which of course involves calculations as to the duration of his life."
"How shocking!" said she.
"I'm as sure as I am of my own life that Osborne never did anything of the kind. But my father expressed his suspicions in language that irritated Osborne, and he didn't speak out, and won't justify himself even as much as he might. And much as he loves me, I've but little influence over him, or else he would tell my father all. Well, we must leave it to time," he added, sighing. "My mother would have brought us all right, if she'd been what she once was."
He turned away, leaving Molly very sad. She knew that every member of the family she cared for so much was in trouble, out of which she saw no exit, and her small power of helping them was diminishing day by day, as Mrs. Hamley sank more and more under the influence of opiates and stupefying illness. Her father had spoken to her only this very day of the desirableness of her returning home for good. Mrs. Gibson wanted her, for no particular reason, but for many small fragments of reasons. Mrs. Hamley had ceased to want her much, only occasionally appearing to remember her existence. Her position, her father thought, the idea had not entered her head, in a family of which the only woman was an invalid confined to bed, was becoming awkward. But Molly had begged hard to remain 2 or 3 days longer, only that, only till Friday. If Mrs. Hamley should want her, she argued, with tears in her eyes, and should hear that she had left the house, she would think her so unkind, so ungrateful.
My dear child, she's getting past wanting any one. The keenness of earthly feelings is deadened.
Papa, that is worst of all. I cannot bear it. I won't believe it. She may not ask for me again, and may quite forget me, but I'm sure to the very last, if the medicines don't stupefy her, she will look round for the squire and her children, for poor Osborne most of all, because he's in sorrow.
Mr. Gibson shook his head, but said nothing in reply. In a minute or two he asked, I don't like to take you away while you even fancy you can be of use or comfort to one who has been so kind to you. But if she hasn't wanted you before Friday, will you be convinced? Will you come home willingly?
If I go then, I may see her once again, even if she hasn't asked for me?
inquired Molly. Yes, of course. You must make no noise, no step, but you may go in and see her. I must tell you, I'm almost certain she won't ask for you.
But she may, papa. I will go home on Friday if she does not. I think she will.
So Molly hung about the house, trying to do all that she could out of the sick-room for the comfort of those in it. They only came out for meals or for necessary business, and found little time for talking to her, so her life was solitary enough, waiting for the call that never came. The evening of the day on which she had had the above conversation with Roger, Osborne arrived. He came straight into the drawing-room, where Molly was seated on the rug, reading by firelight, as she did not like to ring for candles merely for her own use. Osborne came in with a kind of hurry, which almost made him appear as if he would trip himself up and fall down. Molly rose. He had not noticed her before. Now he came forwards and took hold of her hands, leading her into the full flickering light, and straining his eyes to look into her face.
How is she? You will tell me. You must know the truth. I've travelled day and night since I got your father's letter.
Before she could frame her answer, he had sat down in the nearest chair, covering his eyes with his hand.
She's very ill, said Molly. That you know, but I don't think she suffers much pain. She has wanted you sadly.
He groaned aloud.
My father forbade me to come.
I know, said Molly, anxious to prevent his self-reproach. Your brother was away too. I think no one knew how ill she was. She had been an invalid for so long.
You know, yes, she told you a great deal. She was very fond of you. And God knows how I loved her. If I had not been forbidden to come home, I should have told her all. Does my father know of my coming now?
Yes, said Molly. I told him papa had sent for you.
Just at that moment the squire came in. He had not heard of Osborne's arrival, and was seeking Molly to ask her to write a letter for him. Osborne did not stand up when his father entered. He was too much exhausted, too much oppressed by his feelings, and also too much estranged by his father's angry, suspicious letters. If he had come forward with any manifestation of feeling at this moment, everything might have been different. But he waited for his father to see him before he uttered a word. All that the squire said when his eye fell upon him at last was, "You here, sir?" And breaking off in the directions he was giving to Molly, he abruptly left the room. All the time his heart was yearning after his first-born, but mutual pride kept them asunder. Yet he went straight to the butler and asked of him when Mr. Osborne had arrived, and how he had come, and if he had had any refreshment, dinner or what, since his arrival.
For I think I forget everything now,
said the poor squire, putting his hand up to his head.
For the life of me, I can't remember whether we've had dinner or not. These long nights and all this sorrow and watching quite bewilder me.
Perhaps, sir, you will take some dinner with Mr. Osborne. Mrs. Morgan is sending up his directly. You hardly sat down at dinner-time, sir. You thought my mistress wanted something.
Ay, I remember now. No, I won't have any more. Give Mr. Osborne what wine he chooses. Perhaps he can eat and drink.
So the squire went away upstairs with bitterness as well as sorrow in his heart. When lights were brought, Molly was struck with the change in Osborne. He looked haggard and worn, perhaps with travelling and anxiety. Not quite such a dainty gentleman either as Molly had thought him, when she had last seen him calling on her stepmother 2 months before. But she liked him better now. the tone of his remarks pleased her more. He was simpler and less ashamed of showing his feelings. He asked after Roger in a warm, longing kind of way. Roger was out. He had ridden to Ashcombe to transact some business for the squire. Osborne evidently wished for his return, and hung about restlessly in the drawing-room after he had dined. "You're sure I mayn't see her to-night?" he asked Molly for the third or fourth time.
"No, indeed. I will go up again if you like it. But Mrs Jones, the nurse Dr Nicholls sent, is a very decided person. I went up while you were at dinner, and Mrs Hamley had just taken her drops, and was on no account to be disturbed by seeing any one, much less by any excitement." Osborne kept walking up and down the long drawing-room, half talking to himself, half to Molly. "I wish Roger would come. He seems to be the only one to give me a welcome. Does my father always live upstairs in my mother's rooms, Miss Gibson?" "He has done since her last attack. I believe he reproaches himself for not having been enough alarmed before."
"You heard all the words he said to me. They were not much of a welcome, were they? And my dear mother, who always, whether I was to blame or not— I suppose Roger is sure to come home to-night?"
"Quite sure."
"You are staying here, are you not? Do you often see my mother, or does this omnipotent nurse keep you out too?"
"Mrs Hamley hasn't asked for me for 3 days now, and I don't go into her room unless she asks. I'm leaving on Friday, I believe."
"My mother was very fond of you, I know."
After a while he said, in a voice that had a great deal of sensitive pain in its tone,
"I suppose— Do you know whether she is quite conscious, quite herself?"
"Not always conscious," said Molly tenderly. "She has to take so many opiates. But she never wanders, only forgets and sleeps."
"Oh, mother, mother!"
said he, stopping suddenly, and hanging over the fire, his hands on the chimney-piece. When Roger came home, Molly thought it time to retire. Poor girl! It was getting to be time for her to leave this scene of distress in which she could be of no use. She sobbed herself to sleep this Tuesday night. 2 days more, and it would be Friday, and she would have to wrench up the roots she had shot down into this ground. The weather was bright the next morning, and morning and sunny weather cheer up young hearts. Molly sat in the dining-room making tea for the gentlemen as they came down. She could not help hoping that the squire and Osborne might come to a better understanding before she left, for after all, in the dissension between father and son, lay a bitterer sting than in the illness sent by God. But though they met at the breakfast-table, they purposely avoided addressing each other. Perhaps the natural subject of conversation between the two at such a time would have been Osborne's long journey the night before, but he had never spoken of the place he had come from, whether north, south, east, or west, and the squire did not choose to allude to anything that might bring out what his son wished to conceal. Again, there was an unexpressed idea in both their minds that Mrs. Hamley's present illness was much aggravated, if not entirely brought on, by the discovery of Osborne's debts. So many inquiries and answers on that head were tabooed. In fact, their attempts at easy conversation were limited to local subjects, and principally addressed to Molly or Roger. Such intercourse was not productive of pleasure, or even of friendly feeling, though there was a thin outward surface of politeness and peace. Long before the day was over, Molly wished that she had acceded to her father's proposal and gone home with him. No one seemed to want her. Mrs. Jones, the nurse, assured her time after time that Mrs. Hamley had never named her name, and her small services in the sick-room were not required since there was a regular nurse. Osborne and Roger seemed all in all to each other, and Molly now felt how much the short conversations she had had with Roger had served to give her something to think about, all during the remainder of her solitary days. Osborne was extremely polite, had even expressed his gratitude to her for her attentions to his mother in a very pleasant manner, but he appeared to be unwilling to show her any of the deeper feelings of his heart, and almost ashamed of his exhibition of emotion the night before. He spoke to her as any agreeable young man speaks to any pleasant young lady, but Molly almost resented this. It was only the squire who seemed to make her of any account. He gave her letters to write, small bills to reckon up, and she could have kissed his hands for thankfulness. The last afternoon of her stay at the Hall came. Roger had gone out on the squire's business. Molly went into the garden, thinking over the last summer, when Mrs. Hamley's sofa used to be placed under the old cedar tree on the lawn, and when the warm air seemed to be scented with roses and sweetbriar. Now, the trees leafless, there was no sweet odour in the keen frosty air, and looking up at the house there were the white sheets of blinds shutting out the pale winter sky from the invalid's room. Then she thought of the day her father had brought her the news of his second marriage. The thicket was tangled with dead weeds and rime and hoarfrost, and the beautiful fine articulations of branches and boughs and delicate twigs were all intertwined in leafless distinctness against the sky. Could she ever be so passionately unhappy again? Was it goodness, or was it numbness, that made her feel as though life was too short to be troubled much about anything? Death seemed the only reality. She had neither energy nor heart to walk far or briskly, and turned back towards the house. The afternoon sun was shining brightly on the windows, and, stirred up to unusual activity by some unknown cause, the housemaids had opened the shutters and windows of the generally unused library. The middle window was also a door, the white-painted wood went half-way up. Molly turned along the little flag-paved path that led past the library windows to the gate in the white railings at the front of the house, and went in at the opened door. She had had leave given to choose out any books she wished to read and to take them home with her, and it was just the sort of half-dawdling employment suited to her taste this afternoon. She mounted on the ladder to get to a particular shelf high up in a dark corner of the room, and finding there some volume that looked interesting, she sat down on the step to read part of it. There she sat in her bonnet and cloak, when Osborne suddenly came in. He did not see her at first. Indeed, he seemed in such a hurry that he probably might not have noticed her at all, if she had not spoken. "Am I in your way? I only came in here for a moment to look for some books." She came down the steps as she spoke, still holding the book in her hand. "Not at all. It is I who am disturbing you. I must just write a letter for the post, and then I shall be gone. Is not this open door too cold for you?" "Oh, no. It is so fresh and pleasant." She began to read again, sitting on the lowest step of the ladder, he to write at the large old-fashioned writing-table close to the window. There was a minute or two of profound silence, in which the rapid scratching of Osborne's pen upon the paper was the only sound. Then came a click of the gate, and Roger stood at the open door. His face was towards Osborne, sitting in the light, his back to Molly, crouched up in the corner. He held out a letter, and said in hoarse breathlessness, "Here's a letter from your wife, Osborne. I went past the post-office and thought—" Osborne stood up, angry dismay upon his face. "Roger, what have you done? Don't you see her?" Roger looked round, and Molly stood up in her corner, red, trembling, miserable, as though she were a guilty person. Roger entered the room. All three seemed to be equally dismayed. Molly was the first to speak. She came forward and said, "I am so sorry. I didn't wish to hear it, but I couldn't help it. You will trust me, won't you?" And turning to Roger, she said to him, with tears in her eyes, "Please say you know I shall not tell." "We can't help it," said Osborne gloomily. "Only Roger, who knew of what importance it was, ought to have looked round him before speaking." "So I should," said Roger. "I'm more vexed with myself than you can conceive. Not but what I'm as sure of you as of myself," continued he, turning to Molly. "Yes, but," said Osborne, "you see how many chances there are that even the best-meaning persons may let out what it is of such consequence to me to keep secret." "I know you think it so," said Roger. "Well, don't let us begin that old discussion again, at any rate before a third person." Molly had had hard work all this time to keep from crying. Now that she was alluded to as the third person before whom conversation was to be restrained, she said, "I'm going away. Perhaps I ought not to have been here. I'm very sorry, very. But I'll try and forget what I've heard." "You can't do that," said Osborne, still ungraciously. "But will you promise me never to speak about it to anyone?
Not even to me, or to Roger? Will you try to act and speak as if you had never heard it? I'm sure from what Roger has told me about you, that if you give me this promise, I may rely upon it."
"Yes, I will promise," said Molly, putting out her hand as a kind of pledge. Osborne took it, but rather as if the action was superfluous. She added, "I think I should have done so even without a promise, but it is perhaps better to bind oneself. I will go away now. I wish I'd never come into this room." She put down her book on the table very softly, and turned to leave the room, choking down her tears until she was in the solitude of her own chamber. But Roger was at the door before her, holding it open for her, and reading, she felt that he was reading, her face. He held out his hand for hers, and his firm grasp expressed both sympathy and regret for what had occurred. She could hardly keep back her sobs till she reached her bedroom. Her feelings had been overwrought for some time past, without finding the natural vent in action. The leaving Hamley Hall had seemed so sad before, and now she was troubled with having to bear away a secret which she ought never to have known, and the knowledge of which had brought out a very uncomfortable responsibility. Then there would arise a very natural wonder as to who Osborne's wife was. Molly had not stayed so long and so intimately in the Hamley family without being aware of the manner in which the future lady of Hamley was planned for. The squire, for instance, partly in order to show Osborne his heir was above the reach of Molly Gibson, the doctor's daughter, in the early days before he knew Molly well, had often alluded to the grand, the high, and the wealthy marriage which Hamley of Hamley, as represented by his clever, brilliant, handsome son Osborne, might be expected to make. Mrs. Hamley, too, unconsciously on her part, showed the projects that she was constantly devising for the reception of the unknown daughter-in-law that was to be. "The drawing-room must be refurnished when Osborne marries," or "Osborne's wife will like to have the west suite of rooms to herself. It will perhaps be a trial to her to live with the old couple, but we must arrange it so that she will feel it as little as possible. Of course, when Mrs. Osborne comes, we must try and give her a new carriage. The old one does well enough for us." These and similar speeches had given Molly the impression of the future Mrs. Osborne as of some beautiful, grand young lady, whose very presence would make the old hall into a stately, formal mansion, instead of the pleasant, unceremonious home that it was at present. Osborne, too, who had spoken with such languid criticism to Mrs. Gibson about various country belles, and even in his own home was apt to give himself airs, only at home his airs were poetically fastidious, while with Mrs. Gibson they had been socially fastidious. What unspeakably elegant beauty had he chosen for his wife? Who had satisfied him? And yet satisfying him had to have her marriage kept in concealment from his parents. At length Molly tore herself up from her wonderings. It was of no use, she could not find out, she might not even try. The blank wall of her promise blocked up the way. Perhaps it was not even right to wonder, and endeavour to remember slight speeches, casual mentions of a name, so as to piece them together into something coherent. Molly dreaded seeing either of the brothers again, but they all met at dinner-time as if nothing had happened. The squire was taciturn, either from melancholy or displeasure. He had never spoken to Osborne since his return, excepting about the commonest trifles, when intercourse could not be avoided, and his wife's state oppressed him like a heavy cloud coming over the light of day. Osborne put on an indifferent manner to his father, which Molly felt sure was assumed, but it was not conciliatory for all that. Roger, quiet, steady, and natural, talked more than all the others, but he too was uneasy, and in distress on many accounts. To-day he principally addressed himself to Molly, entering into rather long narrations of late discoveries in natural history, which kept up the current of talk without requiring much reply from any one. Molly had expected Osborne to look something different from usual, conscious, or ashamed, or resentful, or even married. But he was exactly the Osborne of the morning, handsome, elegant, languid in manner and in look, cordial with his brother, polite towards her, secretly uneasy at the state of things between his father and himself. She would never have guessed the concealed romance which lay perdu under that everyday behaviour. She had always wished to come into direct contact with a love story. Here she had, and she only found it very uncomfortable.
There was a sense of concealment and uncertainty about it all, and her honest, straightforward father, her quiet life at Hollingford, which, even with all its drawbacks, was above board, and where everybody knew what everybody was doing, seemed secure and pleasant in comparison. Of course she felt great pain at quitting the Hall, and at the mute farewell she had taken of her sleeping and unconscious friend. But leaving Mrs. Hamley now was a different thing to what it had been a fortnight ago. Then she was wanted at any moment, and felt herself to be of comfort. Now her very existence seemed forgotten by the poor lady whose body appeared to be living so long after her soul. She was sent home in the carriage, loaded with true thanks from every one of the family. Osborne ransacked the greenhouses for flowers for her. Roger had chosen her out books of every kind. The squire himself kept shaking her hand, without being able to speak his gratitude, till at last he took her in his arms, and kissed her as he would have done a daughter. Chapter 18. Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 19. Cynthia's Arrival. Molly's father was not at home when she returned, and there was no one to give her a welcome. Mrs. Gibson was out paying calls, the servants told Molly. She went upstairs to her own room, meaning to unpack and arrange her borrowed books. Rather to her surprise, she saw the chamber corresponding to her own being dusted. Water and towels, too, were being carried in. "Is any one coming?" she asked of the housemaid. "Missis's daughter from France. Miss Kirkpatrick is coming to-morrow." Was Cynthia coming at last? Oh, what a pleasure it would be to have a companion, a girl, a sister of her own age! Molly's depressed spirits sprang up again with bright elasticity. She longed for Mrs. Gibson's return to ask her all about it. It must be very sudden, for Mr. Gibson had said nothing of it at the Hall the day before. No quiet reading now, the books were hardly put away with Molly's usual neatness. She went down into the drawing-room, and could not settle to anything. At last Mrs. Gibson came home, tired out with her walk and her heavy velvet cloak. Until that was taken off, and she had rested herself for a few minutes, she seemed quite unable to attend to Molly's questions. "Oh yes, Cynthia is coming home to-morrow, by the Umpire, which passes through at 10 o'clock. What an oppressive day it is for the time of year! I really am almost ready to faint. Cynthia heard of some opportunity, I believe, and was only too glad to leave school a fortnight earlier than we planned. She never gave me the chance of writing to say I did or did not like her coming so much before the time, and I shall have to pay for her just the same as if she had stopped. And I meant to have asked her to bring me a French bonnet, and then you could have had one made after mine. But I'm very glad she's coming, poor dear." "Is anything the matter with her?" asked Molly. "Oh no, why should there be?" "You called her poor dear, and it made me afraid lest she might be ill." "Oh no, it's only a way I got into when Mr. Kirkpatrick died. A fatherless girl. You know one always does call them poor dears. Oh no, Cynthia is never ill. She's as strong as a horse. She never would have felt to-day as I have done. Could you get me a glass of wine and a biscuit, my dear? I'm really quite faint." Mr. Gibson was much more excited about Cynthia's arrival than her own mother was. He anticipated her coming as a great pleasure to Molly, on whom, in spite of his recent marriage and his new wife, his interests principally centred. He even found time to run upstairs and see the bedrooms of the two girls, for the furniture of which he had paid a pretty round sum. "Well, I suppose young ladies like their bedrooms decked out in this way. It's very pretty, certainly, but—" "I liked my old room better, papa, but perhaps Cynthia is accustomed to such decking up." "Perhaps. At any rate, she'll see we've tried to make it pretty. Yours is like hers. That's right. It might have hurt her if hers had been smarter than yours. Now, good night in your fine flimsy bed." Molly was up betimes, almost before it was light, arranging her pretty Hamley flowers in Cynthia's room. She could hardly eat her breakfast that morning. She ran upstairs and put on her things, thinking that Mrs. Gibson was quite sure to go down to the George Inn where the umpire stopped to meet her daughter after a 2 years' absence. But, to her surprise, Mrs. Gibson had arranged herself at her great worsted-work frame just as usual, and she in her turn was astonished at Molly's bonnet and cloak. "Where are you going so early, child? The fog hasn't cleared away yet." "I thought you would go and meet Cynthia, and I wanted to go with you." "She will be here in half an hour, and dear papa has told the gardener to take the wheelbarrow down for her luggage. I'm not sure if he has not gone himself." "Then are you not going?" asked Molly, with a good deal of disappointment. "No, certainly not. She will be here almost directly, and besides, I don't like to expose my feelings to every passer-by in High Street. You forget I have not seen her for 2 years, and I hate scenes in the market-place." She settled herself to her work again, and Molly, after some consideration, gave up her own going, and employed herself in looking out of the downstairs window, which commanded the approach from the town. "Here she is! Here she is!" she cried out at last. Her father was walking by the side of a tall young lady. William the gardener was wheeling along a great cargo of baggage. Molly flew to the front door, and had it wide open to admit the newcomer some time before she arrived.
"Well, here she is. Molly, this is Cynthia. Cynthia, Molly. You're to be sisters, you know."
Molly saw the beautiful, tall, swaying figure against the light of the open door, but could not see any of the features, that were for the moment in shadow. A sudden gush of shyness had come over her just at the instant, and quenched the embrace she would have given a moment before. But Cynthia took her in her arms and kissed her on both cheeks. "Here's mamma," she said, looking beyond Molly onto the stairs where Mrs. Gibson stood, wrapped up in a shawl and shivering in the cold. She ran past Molly and Mr. Gibson, who rather averted their eyes from this first greeting between mother and child. Mrs. Gibson said, "Why, how you are grown, darling! You look quite a woman." "And so I am," said Cynthia. "I was before I went away. I've hardly grown since, except, it is always to be hoped, in wisdom."
"Yes, that we will hope," said Mrs. Gibson, in rather a meaning way.
Indeed, there were evidently hidden allusions in their seemingly commonplace speeches. When they all came into the full light and repose of the drawing-room, Molly was absorbed in the contemplation of Cynthia's beauty. Perhaps her features were not regular, but the changes in her expressive countenance gave one no time to think of that. Her smile was perfect, her pouting charming, the play of the face was in the mouth. Her eyes were beautifully shaped, but their expression hardly seemed to vary. In colouring she was not unlike her mother, only she had not so much of the red-haired tints in her complexion, and her long-shaped, serious grey eyes were fringed with dark lashes, instead of her mother's insipid flaxen ones. Molly fell in love with her, so to speak, on the instant. She sat there warming her feet and hands, as much at her ease as if she had been there all her life, not particularly attending to her mother, who all the time was studying either her or her dress, measuring Molly and Mr. Gibson with grave, observant looks, as if guessing how she should like them.
"There's hot breakfast ready for you in the dining-room, when you are ready for it," said Mr. Gibson. "I'm sure you must want it after your night journey."
He looked round at his wife, at Cynthia's mother, but she did not seem inclined to leave the warm room again. "Molly will take you to your room, darling," said she. "It is near hers, and she has got her things to take off. I'll come and sit in the dining-room while you are having your breakfast, but I really am afraid of the cold now." Cynthia rose and followed Molly upstairs. "I'm so sorry there isn't a fire for you," said Molly. "But I suppose it wasn't ordered, and of course I don't give any orders. Here's some hot water, though." "Stop a minute," said Cynthia, getting hold of both Molly's hands and looking steadily into her face, but in such a manner that she did not dislike the inspection. "I think I shall like you. I am so glad. I was afraid I should not. We're all in a very awkward position together, aren't we? I like your father's looks, though." Molly could not help smiling at the way this was said. Cynthia replied to her smile. "Ah, you may laugh, but I don't know that I am easy to get on with. Mamma and I didn't suit when we were last together, but perhaps we are each of us wiser now. Now, please leave me alone for a quarter of an hour. I don't want anything more." Molly went into her own room, waiting to show Cynthia down to the dining-room. Not that, in the moderate-sized house, there was any difficulty in finding the way. A very little trouble in conjecturing would enable a stranger to discover any room. But Cynthia had so captivated Molly that she wanted to devote herself to the newcomer's service. Ever since she had heard of the probability of her having a sister, she called her a sister, but whether it was a Scotch sister or a sister à la mode de Bretagne would have puzzled most people. Molly had allowed her fancy to dwell much on the idea of Cynthia's coming, and in the short time since they had met, Cynthia's unconscious power of fascination had been exercised upon her. Some people have this power. Of course its effects are only manifested in the susceptible. A schoolgirl may be found in every school who attracts and influences all the others, not by her virtues, nor her beauty, nor her sweetness, nor her cleverness, but by something that can neither be described nor reasoned upon. It is the something alluded to in the old lines: "Love me not for comely grace, for my pleasing eye and face, no, nor for my constant heart, for these may change and turn to ill, and thus true love may sever. But love me on, and know not why, so hast thou the same reason still, to dote upon me ever." A woman will have this charm, not only over men, but over her own sex. It cannot be defined. Or rather, it is so delicate a mixture of many gifts and qualities, that it is impossible to decide on the proportions of each. Perhaps it is incompatible with very high principle, as its essence seems to consist in the most exquisite power of adaptation to varying people and still more various moods, being all things to all men. At any rate, Molly might soon have been aware that Cynthia was not remarkable for unflinching morality, but the glamour thrown over her would have prevented Molly from any attempt at penetrating into and judging her companion's character, even had such processes been the least in accordance with her own disposition. Cynthia was very beautiful, and was so well aware of this fact that she had forgotten to care about it. No one with such loveliness ever appeared so little conscious of it. Molly would watch her perpetually as she moved about the room, with the free stately step of some wild animal of the forest, moving almost as it were to the continual sound of music. Her dress, too, though now to our ideas it would be considered ugly and disfiguring, was suited to her complexion and figure, and the fashion of it subdued within due bounds by her exquisite taste. It was inexpensive enough, and the changes in it were but few. Mrs. Gibson professed herself shocked to find that Cynthia had but 4 gowns, when she might have stocked herself so well, and brought over so many useful French patterns, if she had but patiently waited for her mother's answer to the letter which she had sent, announcing her return by the opportunity Madame had found for her. Molly was hurt for Cynthia at all these speeches. She thought that they implied that the pleasure which her mother felt in seeing her a fortnight sooner after her 2 years' absence was inferior to that which she would have received from a bundle of silver paper patterns. But Cynthia took no apparent notice of the frequent recurrence of these small complaints. Indeed, she received much of what her mother said with a kind of complete indifference, that made Mrs. Gibson hold her rather in awe, and she was much more communicative to Molly than to her own child. With regard to dress, however, Cynthia soon showed that she was her mother's own daughter in the manner in which she could use her deft and nimble fingers. She was a capital workwoman, and unlike Molly, who excelled in plain sewing, but had no notion of dressmaking or millinery, she could repeat the fashions she had only seen in passing along the streets of Boulogne, with 1 or 2 pretty rapid movements of her hands, as she turned and twisted the ribbons and gauze her mother furnished her with. So she refurbished Mrs. Gibson's wardrobe, doing it all in a sort of contemptuous manner, the source of which Molly could not quite make out. Day after day the course of these small frivolities was broken in upon by the news Mr. Gibson brought of Mrs. Hamley's nearer approach to death. Molly, very often sitting by Cynthia and surrounded by ribbon and wire and net, heard the bulletins like the toll of a funeral bell at a marriage feast. Her father sympathized with her. It was the loss of a dear friend to him too, but he was so accustomed to death that it seemed to him but as it was, the natural end of all things human. To Molly, the death of someone she had known so well and loved so much was a sad and gloomy phenomenon. She loathed the small vanities with which she was surrounded, and would wander out into the frosty garden and pace the walk, which was both sheltered and concealed by evergreens. At length, and yet it was not so long, not a fortnight since Molly had left the Hall, the end came. Mrs. Hamley had sunk out of life as gradually as she had sunk out of consciousness and her place in this world. The quiet waves closed over her, and her place knew her no more. "They all sent their love to you, Molly," said her father. "Roger said he knew how you would feel it." Mr. Gibson had come in very late, and was having a solitary dinner in the dining-room. Molly was sitting near to him to keep him company. Cynthia and her mother were upstairs. The latter was trying on a head-dress which Cynthia had made for her. Molly remained downstairs after her father had gone out afresh on his final round among his town patients. The fire was growing very low, and the lights were waning. Cynthia came softly in, and taking Molly's listless hand, that hung down by her side, sat at her feet on the rug, chafing her chilly fingers without speaking. The tender action thawed the tears that had been gathering heavily at Molly's heart, and they came dropping down her cheeks. "You loved her dearly, did you not, Molly?"
"Yes,"
sobbed Molly, and then there was a silence.
"Had you known her long?" "No, not a year, but I had seen a great deal of her. I was almost like a daughter to her, she said so. Yet I never bid her good-bye or anything. Her mind became weak and confused."
"She had only sons, I think?"
"No, only Mr. Osborne and Mr. Roger Hamley. She had a daughter once, Fanny. Sometimes in her illness she used to call me Fanny."
The two girls were silent for some time, both gazing into the fire. Cynthia spoke first. "I wish I could love people as you do, Molly."
"Don't you?"
said the other in surprise.
"No. A good number of people love me, I believe, or at least they think they do, but I never seem to care much for anyone. I do believe I love you, little Molly, whom I have only known for 10 days, better than anyone."
"Not than your mother?" said Molly in grave astonishment.
"Yes, than my mother,"
replied Cynthia, half smiling.
"It's very shocking, I dare say, but it is so. Now don't go and condemn me. I don't think love for one's mother quite comes by nature, and remember how much I have been separated from mine. I loved my father, if you will," she continued, with the force of truth in her tone, and then she stopped. "But he died when I was quite a little thing, and no one believes that I remember him. I heard mamma say to a caller, not a fortnight after his funeral, 'Oh no, Cynthia is too young, she has quite forgotten him.' And I bit my lips to keep from crying out, 'Papa, papa, have I?' But it's of no use. Well, then, mamma had to go out as a governess. She couldn't help it, poor thing. But she didn't much care for parting with me. I was a trouble, I dare say. So I was sent to school at 4 years old, first one school and then another, and in the holidays mamma went to stay at grand houses, and I was generally left with the schoolmistresses. Once I went to the Towers, and mamma lectured me continually, and yet I was very naughty, I believe, and so I never went again, and I was very glad of it, for it was a horrid place." "That it was," said Molly, who remembered her own day of tribulation there. "And once I went to London, to stay with my uncle Kirkpatrick. He is a lawyer, and getting on now, but then he was poor enough, and had 6 or 7 children. It was winter time, and we were all shut up in a small house in Doughty Street. But after all, that wasn't so bad." "But then you lived with your mother when she began school at Ashcombe. Mr. Preston told me that, when I stayed that day at the Manor House." "What did he tell you?" asked Cynthia, almost fiercely. "Nothing but that. Oh yes, he praised your beauty, and wanted me to tell you what he had said." "I should have hated you if you had," said Cynthia. "Of course I never thought of doing such a thing," replied Molly. "I didn't like him, and Lady Harriet spoke of him the next day as if he wasn't a person to be liked." Cynthia was quite silent. At length she said, "I wish I was good." "So do I," said Molly simply.
She was thinking again of Mrs. Hamley. Only the actions of the just smell sweet and blossom in the dust. And goodness just then seemed to her to be the only enduring thing in the world.
Nonsense, Molly. You are good. At least, if you're not good, what am I? There's a rule of three sum for you to do. But it's no use talking. I am not good, and I never shall be now. Perhaps I might be a heroine still, but I shall never be a good woman, I know. Do you think it easier to be a heroine? Yes, as far as one knows of heroines from history. I'm capable of a great jerk, a great effort, and then a relaxation. But steady, everyday goodness is just beyond me. I must be a moral kangaroo.
Molly could not follow Cynthia's ideas. She could not distract herself from the thoughts of the sorrowing group at the Hall.
How I should like to see them all, and yet one can do nothing at such a time. Papa says the funeral is to be on Tuesday, and that after that Mr. Roger Hamley is to go back to Cambridge. It will seem as if nothing had happened. I wonder how the Squire and Mr. Osborne Hamley will get on together. He is the eldest son, is he not? Why shouldn't he and his father get on well together? Oh, I don't know. That is to say, I do know, but I think I ought not to tell. Don't be so pedantically truthful, Molly. Besides, your manner shows when you speak truth and when you speak falsehood, without troubling yourself to use words. I knew exactly what your "I don't know" meant. I never consider myself bound to be truthful, so I beg we may be on equal terms.
Cynthia might well say she did not consider herself bound to be truthful. She literally said what came uppermost, without caring very much whether it was accurate or not. But there was no ill nature, and in a general way no attempt at procuring any advantage for herself in all her deviations, and there was often such a latent sense of fun in them that Molly could not help being amused with them in fact, though she condemned them in theory. Cynthia's playfulness of manner glossed such failings over with a kind of charm, and yet at times she was so soft and sympathetic that Molly could not resist her, even when she affirmed the most startling things. The little account she made of her own beauty pleased Mr. Gibson extremely, and her pretty deference to him won his heart. She was restless, too, till she had attacked Molly's dress, after she had remodelled her mother's. "Now for you, sweet one," said she, as she began upon one of Molly's gowns. "I've been working as a connoisseur until now. Now I begin as amateur." She brought down her pretty artificial flowers, plucked out of her own best bonnet to put into Molly's, saying they would suit her complexion, and that a knot of ribbons would do well enough for her. All the time she worked she sang. She had a sweet voice in singing as well as in speaking, and used to run up and down her gay French chanson without any difficulty, so flexible in the art was she. Yet she did not seem to care for music. She rarely touched the piano, on which Molly practised with daily conscientiousness. Cynthia was always willing to answer questions about her previous life, though after the first she rarely alluded to it of herself. But she was a most sympathetic listener to all Molly's innocent confidences of joys and sorrows, sympathizing even to the extent of wondering how she could endure Mr. Gibson's second marriage, and why she did not take some active steps of rebellion. In spite of all this agreeable and pungent variety of companionship at home, Molly yearned after the Hamleys. If there had been a woman in that family, she would probably have received many little notes, and heard numerous details which were now lost to her, or summed up in condensed accounts of her father's visits at the Hall, which, since his dear patient was dead, were only occasional. "Yes, the squire is a good deal changed, but he's better than he was. There's an unspoken estrangement between him and Osborne. One can see it in the silence and constraint of their manners, but outwardly they are friendly, civil at any rate. The squire will always respect Osborne as his heir, and the future representative of the family. Osborne doesn't look well. He says he wants change. I think he's weary of the domestic dullness or domestic dissension. But he feels his mother's death acutely. It's a wonder that he and his father are not drawn together by their common loss. Roger's away at Cambridge, too, examination for the mathematical tripos. Altogether the aspect of both people and place is changed. It is but natural." Such is perhaps the summing up of the news of the Hamleys as contained in many bulletins. They always ended in some kind message to Molly. Mrs. Gibson generally said, as a comment upon her husband's account of Osborne's melancholy, "My dear, why don't you ask him to dinner here? A little quiet dinner, you know. Cook is quite up to it, and we would all of us wear blacks and lilacs. He wouldn't consider that his gaiety." Mr. Gibson took no more notice of these suggestions than by shaking his head. He had grown accustomed to his wife by this time, and regarded silence on his own part as a great preservative against long inconsequential arguments. But every time that Mrs. Gibson was struck by Cynthia's beauty, she thought it more and more advisable that Mr. Osborne Hamley should be cheered up by a little quiet dinner-party. As yet no one but the ladies of Hollingford and Mr. Ashton the vicar, that hopeless and impracticable old bachelor, had seen Cynthia, and what was the good of having a lovely daughter if there were none but old women to admire her? Cynthia herself appeared extremely indifferent upon the subject, and took very little notice of her mother's constant talk about the gaieties that were possible, and the gaieties that were impossible in Hollingford. She exerted herself just as much to charm the two Miss Brownings as she would have done to delight Osborne Hamley or any other young heir. That is to say, she used no exertion, but simply followed her own nature, which was to attract every one of those she was thrown amongst. The exertion seemed rather to be to refrain from doing so, and to protest, as she often did, by slight words and expressive looks against her mother's words and humours, alike against her folly and her caresses. Molly was almost sorry for Mrs. Gibson, who seemed so unable to gain influence over her child. One day Cynthia read Molly's thought. "I'm not good, and I told you so. Somehow I cannot forgive her for her neglect of me as a child, when I would have clung to her. Besides, I hardly ever heard from her when I was at school. And I know she put a stop to my coming over to her wedding. I saw the letter she wrote to Madame Lefebvre. A child should be brought up with its parents, if it is to think them infallible when it grows up." "But though it may know that there must be faults," replied Molly, "it ought to cover them over and try to forget their existence." "It ought. But don't you see I have grown up outside the pale of duty and oughts? Love me as I am, sweet one, for I shall never be better." End of chapter 19. Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters, by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 20. Mrs. Gibson's Visitors. One day, to Molly's infinite surprise, Mr. Preston was announced as a caller. Mrs. Gibson and she were sitting together in the drawing-room. Cynthia was out, gone into the town a-shopping, when the door was opened, the name given, and in walked the young man. His entrance seemed to cause more confusion than Molly could well account for. He came in with the same air of easy assurance with which he had received her and her father at Ashcombe Manor House. He looked remarkably handsome in his riding dress, and with the open-air exercise he had just had. But Mrs. Gibson's smooth brows contracted a little at the sight of him, and her reception of him was much cooler than that which she usually gave to visitors. Yet there was a degree of agitation in it which surprised Molly a little. Mrs. Gibson was at her everlasting worsted-work frame when Mr. Preston entered the room, but somehow in rising to receive him she threw down her basket of crewels, and declining Molly's offer to help her, she would pick up all the reels herself before she asked her visitor to sit down. He stood there, hat in hand, affecting an interest in the recovery of the worsted which Molly was sure he did not feel, for all the time his eyes were glancing round the room, and taking note of the details in the arrangement. At length they were seated, and conversation began. "It is the first time I have been in Hollingford since your marriage, Mrs. Gibson, or I should certainly have called to pay my respects sooner." "I know you are very busy at Ashcombe. I did not expect you to call. Is Lord Cumnor at the Towers? I have not heard from her ladyship for more than a week." "No, he seemed still detained at Bath, but I had a letter from him giving me certain messages for Mr. Sheepshanks. Mr. Gibson is not at home, I'm afraid." "No, he is a great deal out, almost constantly, I may say. I had no idea that I should see so little of him.
A doctor's wife leads a very solitary life, Mr. Preston."
"You can hardly call it solitary, I should think, when you have such a companion as Miss Gibson always at hand," said he, bowing to Molly.
"Oh, but I call it solitude for a wife when her husband is away. Poor Mr. Kirkpatrick was never happy unless I always went with him. All his walks, all his visits, he liked me to be with him. But somehow Mr. Gibson feels as if I should rather be in his way." "I don't think you could ride pillion behind him on Black Bess, mamma," said Molly; "and unless you could do that, you could hardly go with him in his rounds up and down all the rough lanes." "Oh, but he might keep a brougham. I've often said so, and then I could use it for visiting in the evenings. Really, it was one reason why I didn't go to the Hollingford charity ball. I couldn't bring myself to use the dirty fly from the George. We really must stir papa up against next winter, Molly. It will never do for you and—" She pulled herself up suddenly, and looked furtively at Mr. Preston to see if he had taken any notice of her abruptness. Of course he had, but he was not going to show it. He turned to Molly and said, "Have you ever been to a public ball yet, Miss Gibson?" "No," said Molly.
"It will be a great pleasure to you when the time comes."
"I'm not sure. I shall like it if I have plenty of partners, but I'm afraid I shan't know many people."
"And you suppose that young men haven't their own ways and means of being introduced to pretty girls?" It was exactly one of the speeches Molly had disliked him for before, and delivered too in that kind of underbred manner which showed that it was meant to convey a personal compliment. Molly took great credit to herself for the unconcerned manner with which she went on with her tatting, exactly as if she had never heard it. "I only hope I may be one of your partners at the first ball you go to. Pray remember my early application for that honor, when you were overwhelmed with requests for dances."
"I don't choose to engage myself beforehand," said Molly, perceiving from under her dropped eyelids that he was leaning forward and looking at her as though he was determined to have an answer.
"Young ladies are always very cautious in fact, however modest they may be in profession," he replied, addressing himself in a nonchalant manner to Mrs. Gibson. "In spite of Miss Gibson's apprehension of not having many partners, she declines the certainty of having one. I suppose Miss Kirkpatrick will have returned from France before then?" He said these last words exactly in the same tone as he had used before, but Molly's instinct told her that he was making an effort to do so. She looked up. He was playing with his hat, almost as if he did not care to have any answer to his question. Yet he was listening acutely, and with a half smile on his face. Mrs. Gibson reddened a little and hesitated.
"Yes, certainly. My daughter will be with us next winter, I believe, and I dare say she will go out with us." "Why can't she say at once that Cynthia is here now?" asked Molly of herself, yet glad that Mr. Preston's curiosity was baffled. He still smiled, but this time he looked up at Mrs. Gibson as he asked, "You have good news from her, I hope?" "Yes, very. By the way, how are our old friends, the Robinsons? How often I think of their kindness to me at Ashcombe. Dear good people, I wish I could see them again."
"I will certainly tell them of your kind inquiries. They are very well, I believe."
Just at this moment Molly heard the familiar sound of the click and opening of the front door. She knew it must be Cynthia, and, conscious of some mysterious reason which made Mrs. Gibson wish to conceal her daughter's whereabouts from Mr. Preston, and maliciously desirous to baffle him, she rose to leave the room, and meet Cynthia on the stairs, but one of the lost crewels of worsted had entangled itself in her gown and feet, and before she had freed herself of the encumbrance, Cynthia had opened the drawing-room door, and stood in it, looking at her mother, at Molly, at Mr. Preston, but not advancing one step. Her colour, which had been brilliant the first moment of her entrance, faded away as she gazed. But her eyes, her beautiful eyes, usually so soft and grave, seemed to fill with fire, and her brows to contract as she took the resolution to come forward and take her place among the three, who were all looking at her with different emotions. She moved calmly and slowly forwards. Mr. Preston went a step or two to meet her, his hand held out, and the whole expression of his face that of eager delight. But she took no notice of the outstretched hand, nor of the chair that he offered her. She sat down on a little sofa in one of the windows, and called Molly to her. "Look at my purchases,"
said she. "This green ribbon was 14 pence a yard, this silk 3 shillings." And so she went on, forcing herself to speak about these trifles as if they were all the world to her, and she had no attention to throw away on her mother and her mother's visitor. Mr. Preston took his cue from her. He, too, talked of the news of the day, the local gossip, but Molly, who glanced up at him from time to time, was almost alarmed by the bad expression of suppressed anger, almost amounting to vindictiveness, which entirely marred his handsome looks. She did not wish to look again, and tried rather to back up Cynthia's efforts at maintaining a separate conversation. Yet she could not help overhearing Mrs. Gibson's strain after increased civility, as if to make up for Cynthia's rudeness, and, if possible, to deprecate his anger. She talked perpetually, as though her object were to detain him, whereas previous to Cynthia's return she had allowed frequent pauses in the conversation, as though to give him the opportunity to take his leave. In the course of the conversation between them, the Hamleys came up. Mrs. Gibson was never unwilling to dwell upon Molly's intimacy with this county family, and when the latter caught the sound of her own name, her stepmother was saying, "Poor Mrs. Hamley could hardly do without Molly. She quite looked upon her as a daughter, especially towards the last, when I am afraid she had a great deal of anxiety. Mr. Osborne Hamley, I dare say you have heard, he did not do so well at college, and they had expected so much. Parents will, you know, but what did it signify? For he had not to earn his living. I call it a very foolish kind of ambition when a young man has not to go into a profession." "Well, at any rate, the squire must be satisfied now. I saw this morning's Times with the Cambridge examination lists in it. Is it the second son called after his father, Roger?" "Yes," said Molly, starting up and coming nearer.
"He's senior wrangler, that's all," said Mr. Preston, almost as though he were vexed with himself for having anything to say that could give her pleasure. Molly went back to her seat by Cynthia.
"Poor Mrs. Hamley," said she, very softly, as if to herself.
Cynthia took her hand in sympathy with Molly's sad and tender look, rather than because she understood all that was passing in her mind, nor did she quite understand it herself. A death that had come out of time, a wonder whether the dead knew what passed upon the earth they had left, the brilliant Osborne's failure, Roger's success, the vanity of human wishes. All these thoughts and what they suggested were inextricably mingled up in her mind. She came to herself in a few minutes. Mr. Preston was saying all the unpleasant things he could think of about the Hamleys in a tone of false sympathy. "The poor old squire, not the wisest of men, has woefully mismanaged his estate. And Osborne Hamley is too fine a gentleman to understand the means by which to improve the value of the land, even if he had the capital. A man who had practical knowledge of agriculture, and some thousands of ready money, might bring the rental up to 8,000 or so. Of course, Osborne will try and marry someone with money. The family is old and well established, and he mustn't object to commercial descent, though I dare say the squire will for him. But then the young fellow himself is not the man for the work. No, the family is going down fast, and it's a pity when these old Saxon houses vanish off the land. But it is kismet with the Hamleys. Even the senior wrangler, if it is that Roger Hamley, he will have spent all his brains in one effort. You never hear of a senior wrangler being worth anything afterwards. He'll be a fellow of his college, of course. That will be a livelihood for him at any rate."
"I believe in senior wranglers," said Cynthia, her clear high voice ringing through the room. "And from all I've ever heard of Mr. Roger Hamley, I believe he will keep up the distinction he has earned. And I don't believe that the house of Hamley is so near extinction in wealth and fame and good name."
"They are fortunate in having Miss Kirkpatrick's good word," said Mr. Preston, rising to take his leave.
"Dear Molly," said Cynthia in a whisper, "I know nothing about your friends the Hamleys, except that they are your friends, and what you have told me about them. But I won't have that man speaking of them so, and your eyes filling with tears all the time. I'd sooner swear to their having all the talents and good fortune under the sun."
The only person of whom Cynthia appeared to be wholesomely afraid was Mr. Gibson. When he was present, she was more careful in speaking, and showed more deference to her mother. Her evident respect for him, and desire to win his good opinion, made her curb herself before him, and in this manner she earned his favor as a lively, sensible girl, with just so much knowledge of the world as made her a very desirable companion to Molly. Indeed, she made something of the same kind of impression on all men. They were first struck with her personal appearance, and then with her pretty, deprecating manner, which appealed to them much as if she had said, "You are wise, and I am foolish. Have mercy on my folly." It was a way she had, it meant nothing really, and she was hardly conscious of it herself, but it was very captivating all the same. Even old Williams, the gardener, felt it. He said to his confidante, Molly, "Eh, miss, but that be a rare young lady. She do have such pretty coaxing ways. I be to teach her to bud roses come the season, and I'll warrant ye she'll learn sharp enough, for all she says, she be so stupid." If Molly had not the sweetest disposition in the world, she might have become jealous of all the allegiance laid at Cynthia's feet, but she never thought of comparing the amount of admiration and love which they each received. Yet once she did feel a little as if Cynthia were poaching on her manner. The invitation to the quiet dinner had been sent to Osborne Hamley, and declined by him. But he thought it right to call soon afterwards. It was the first time Molly had seen any of the family since she left the Hall, just before Mrs. Hamley's death, and there was so much that she wanted to ask. She tried to wait patiently till Mrs. Gibson had exhausted the first gush of her infinite nothings, and then Molly came in with her modest questions. How was the squire? Had he returned to his old habits? Had his health suffered? Putting each inquiry with as light and delicate a touch as if she had been dressing a wound. She hesitated a little, a very little, before speaking of Roger. For just one moment the thought flitted across her mind that Osborne might feel the contrast between his own and his brother's college career too painfully to like to have it referred to. But then she remembered the generous brotherly love that had always existed between the two, and had just entered upon the subject, when Cynthia, in obedience to her mother's summons, came into the room, and took up her work. No one could have been quieter. She hardly uttered a word, but Osborne seemed to fall under her power at once. He no longer gave his undivided attention to Molly. He cut short his answers to her questions, and by, without Molly's rightly understanding how it was, he had turned towards Cynthia and was addressing himself to her. Molly saw the look of content on Mrs. Gibson's face. Perhaps it was her own mortification at not having heard all she wished to know about Roger, which gave her a keener insight than usual, but certain it is that all at once she perceived that Mrs. Gibson would not dislike a marriage between Osborne and Cynthia, and considered the present occasion as an auspicious beginning. Remembering the secret which she had been let into so unwillingly, Molly watched his behaviour, almost as if she had been retained in the interest of the absent wife. But after all, thinking as much of the possibility of his attracting Cynthia as of the unknown and mysterious Mrs. Osborne Hamley. His manner was expressive of great interest and of strong prepossession in favour of the beautiful girl to whom he was talking. He was in deep mourning, which showed off his slight figure and delicate refined face. But there was nothing of flirting, as far as Molly understood the meaning of the word, in either looks or words. Cynthia, too, was extremely quiet. She was always much quieter with men than with women. It was part of the charm of her soft allurement that she was so passive. They were talking of France. Mrs. Gibson herself had passed 2 or 3 years of her girlhood there, and Cynthia's late return from Boulogne made it a very natural subject of conversation. But Molly was thrown out of it, and with her heart still unsatisfied as to the details of Roger's success, she had to stand up at last and receive Osborne's good-bye, scarcely longer or more intimate than his farewell to Cynthia. As soon as he was gone, Mrs. Gibson began in his praise. "Well, really, I begin to have some faith in long descent. What a gentleman he is! How agreeable and polite! So different from that forward Mr. Preston," she continued, looking a little anxiously at Cynthia. Cynthia, quite aware that her reply was being watched for, said coolly, "Mr. Preston doesn't improve on acquaintance. There was a time, mamma, when I think both you and I thought him very agreeable." "I don't remember. You've a clearer memory than I have. But we were talking of this delightful Mr. Osborne Hamley. Why, Molly, you were always talking of his brother. It was Roger this and Roger that. I can't think how it was you so seldom mentioned this young man." "I didn't know I had mentioned Mr. Roger Hamley so often," said Molly, blushing a little. "But I saw much more of him. He was more at home." "Well, well, it's all right, my dear. I dare say he suits you best. But really, when I saw Osborne Hamley close to my Cynthia, I couldn't help thinking,
But perhaps I'd better not tell you what I was thinking of. Only they are each of them so much above the average in appearance, and of course that suggests things." "I perfectly understand what you were thinking of, mamma," said Cynthia with the greatest composure, "and so does Molly, I have no doubt." "Well, there's no harm in it, I'm sure. Did you hear him say that though he did not like to leave his father alone just at present, yet that when his brother Roger came back from Cambridge, he should feel more at liberty? It was quite as much as to say, if you will ask me to dinner then, I shall be delighted to come. And chickens will be so much cheaper, and cook has such a nice way of boning them, and doing them up with forcemeat. Everything seems to be falling out so fortunately. And Molly, my dear, you know I won't forget you. By and by, when Roger Hamley has taken his turn at stopping at home with his father, we will ask him to one of our little quiet dinners." Molly was very slow at taking this in, but in about a minute the sense of it had reached her brain, and she went all over very red and hot, especially as she saw that Cynthia was watching the light come into her mind with great amusement. "I'm afraid Molly isn't properly grateful, mamma. If I were you, I wouldn't exert myself to give a dinner party on her account. Bestow all your kindness upon me." Molly was often puzzled by Cynthia's speeches to her mother, and this was one of these occasions. But she was more anxious to say something for herself. She was so much annoyed at the implication in Mrs. Gibson's last words. "Mr. Roger Hamley has been very good to me. He was a great deal at home when I was there, and Mr. Osborne Hamley was very little there. That was the reason I spoke so much more of one than the other. If he had, losing her coherence in the difficulty of finding words, I don't think I should. Oh, Cynthia, instead of laughing at me, I think you might help me to explain myself." Instead, Cynthia gave a diversion to the conversation. "Mamma's paragon gives me an idea of weakness. I can't quite make out whether it's in body or mind. Which is it, Molly?" "He is not strong, I know, but he's very accomplished and clever. Everyone says that, even papa, who doesn't generally praise young men. That made the puzzle the greater when he did so badly at college." "Then it's his character that is weak. I'm sure there's weakness somewhere, but he's very agreeable. It must have been very pleasant staying at the Hall." "Yes, but it's all over now." "Oh, nonsense," said Mrs. Gibson, wakening up from counting the stitches in her pattern. "We shall have the young men coming to dinner pretty often, you'll see. Your father likes them, and I shall always make a point of welcoming his friends. They can't go on mourning for a mother for ever. I expect we shall see a great deal of them, and that the two families will become very intimate. After all, these good Hollingford people are terribly behindhand, and I should say rather commonplace." End of chapter 20.